Welcome everybody to panel. You guys are here at 100 Years of Narrative Art. You guys you're in the right place, right? Don't leave. Okay. How long does it take to open this? So actually, I'm just curious because each convention I go to, this is a panel that's not exclusively My Little Pony, so I do this at a bunch of comic and anime conventions and gaming conventions. But I'm just curious about what type of people this type of panel draws. So any reasons why in particular you guys are here aside from me trying to force you to say? Okay. So sometimes I get people who are interested in the topic of history. Sometimes I just get people who walked in. Sometimes people are interested because of I tie in tarot with this, but let's. I missed the question. Oh, like what? Why are you interested in this panel? Contending this panel?
You sold it good. You're asking us.
So what's an open source thing?
It's like a free version of it.
Oh, I hope all the pictures work in here.
That looks like it did.
Okay.
I don't know what the problem is though.
Well, I guess.
Speed it up.
Okay.
I guess an answer I could give is I think it's kind of interesting when people like look at like kind of like the small things.
Yeah.
And kind of push things to go where they go. And I kind of like to look at things mechanically a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And so whenever like people break things down like that into like small little things, I think it's kind of cool. So I guess that's why I kind of think it's going to be.
Okay. Awesome then. We're still trying to get this thing working, so hope.
Wait, was the question why, like, the audience finds the topic?
Yeah, I'm just trying to kill time, basically, just to get this working. Okay, so how do we switch it so...
Why is it?
That's weird, it's just like reverse or something. You just drag it into the other... You just replicate screen, or...
It's probably not sending to the projector correctly.
Anyone good with computers? Okay, let's try. Okay.
They should duplicate.
Okay.
Okay, that's better.
Okay, and then now would it be on automatic and I just press it?
5.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay. Awesome.
Sorry about that.
Thanks a lot for your help.
Oh, no problem.
Everyone give him a round of applause for letting me borrow his laptop. Okay, so welcome to my panel at TrotCon. This is actually the second time I've done this at TrotCon. I did this last year. I think I have about 2 people stay for the whole time, so this is a much better turnout. Let me first introduce myself. My name is Alexander. You might know me as South Park Dallas on DeviantArt and Chocopony on Tumblr. I graduated from the Army Navy Academy where I was a cadet officer, and I'm actually now doing medical research and trying to get my medical degree at Johns Hopkins University. On my free time, I like doing art. Some things I specialize in are coins. Other things I do is write history books, which is something I have a passion in. I'm involved with 2 podcasts. The My Little Pony podcast called The Podcast, which TJ, who was the moderator of last panel, was on. And I also do a Doctor Who podcast. So, and here's my convention schedule for the rest of the year if you guys are interested. Check out what other panels I'm doing. Okay, so let's start. If you guys know me, I actually do tarot cards for, what's this? Go away. I did the My Little Pony tarot cards, and I actually have an interesting fascination with tarot. A few years ago, I found Alan Moore's comic Promethea, and in that comic, he actually tracked the history of man from the Big Bang to the end of the world, using each of the major arcana cards to chronicle the history, and I think that actually fits perfectly. So for this panel, I decided to use 22 events that represent the tarot cards that actually make up this 100-year progress that we went through. So what inspired this panel specifically? As I said, Alan Moore was the person who got me interested in tarot and also was the person who got me interested in art and storytelling. if you guys know Alan Moore, he is famous for Watchmen, which is considered one of the greatest graphic novels of all time, V for Vendetta, which all the anonymous people use for the protests. And one of my favorite stories that he does is called League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. You might know it from the horrible Sean Connery movie, but the actual comic itself is really in-depth, meta, and has a lot of commentary. The latest volume of League of Extraordinary Gentlemen takes place in 3 different time periods. The first one takes place in 1910, second one takes place in the 60s, third one takes place in the modern day. And with it, Alan Moore actually uses his story to critique the decline of modern culture. He believes that everything since the Victorian era has gone down, that characters like Sherlock Holmes and Dracula were the pinnacle of characters, and that every single character we have nowadays, from like Doctor Who to Harry Potter, have been the derivative of these original characters. One of the interesting examples is Alan Moore is a practitioner in black magic, and one of the most famous British magicians is a person named Aleister Crowley. You can see his picture there. In the first League book, he actually, Crowley is actually the person who inspired a lot of fictional black magicians and wizards. And one of the first stories that actually poked fun at Crowley was a story by Somerset Maugham called The Magician, and in that there's a character called Oliver Haddo, and that's basically the character that fights in this book. Crowley then becomes the character from Rosemary Baby, the satanic priest, and actually Voldemort's inspired by Aleister Crowley. So actually, if you read the latest League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, you see that takes place in Hogwarts, and there's a lot of interesting meta commentary. But Alan Moore, for some reason, likes stuff like Dracula and Shakespeare, but hates Harry Potter. So what's the reason behind this? Is he right? Has culture really declined in the last century? Well, let's first take a look at what pop culture is. So we start with the first card, the Fool. The Fool represents a starter journey. And this is actually a good time period. I want to use the year 1911 to actually start this 100-year process, because you have the end of the Victorian era, which Alan Moore credits as the pinnacle of culture, ending in 2010. You have the end of the Qing Dynasty in 2011, the end of the Japanese Meiji era in 1912. So since I'm actually from a Chinese background, I'll talk a little bit about how art evolved in China. You see a lot of techniques that are used today, like television, film, animation, actually have its roots in China and Japan and a lot of stuff. So, and actually, if you look at the past, before the rise of the great Western novel, a lot of historians believe that the greatest novel-producing country was China, because you have the 4 great novels of China. It wasn't until Don Quixote was written that the West kind of took over the whole entire novel writing process. But China was originally considered the land of new artistic innovation, the inventor of a lot of these things that allowed for new artwork to be created. For example, show puppets, the printing press allowed for books. But what was happening to China during this period was it was taken over by the Manchus, and since then art has declined. So in that vacuum, the West basically picked up on the idea of expanding culture. The birth of popular culture kind of comes with the birth of literary criticism. You might know Jane Austen. She was very big in the Victorian scene, wrote a lot of books about middle-class people. Before then, art and stories were reserved for the elite, the kings, the royalty, because books were expensive to make, plays were expensive to go to. So most stories you have revolved around Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey, which was, it's basically a high-class fantasy, only reserved for rich, upper, white, middle-class Europeans. Jane Austen was actually the first to start writing about the middle-class people. And when the middle-class people realized, hey, our stories are just important as the upper-class people, they started forming little group circles, basically the first fandoms, to talk about their love of Jane Austen books. And there's where you get the idea of stories and art not being just reserved for the upper class, but for the middle class as well. As printing became more and more popular and cheaper, it started trickling down to the lower classes, and when lower classes got to observe a lot of these works, they would form their own little groups and fandoms. Sherlock Holmes is one of the prime examples of the modern fandom. You see a lot of fan fiction written about Sherlock Holmes from that day, and even extending on to today. But, okay, so what happened in October 10th, 1911? I was talking about China, how China was traditionally the center of a lot of this artistic innovation. But for the last century, China has been controlled by the Manchurian dynasty. And it was October 10th, 1911, that China actually rebelled. and reformed a new republic. It will be, of course, eventually controlled by communists, and they would suppress art as much as the Manchurians did. But this was actually a sign of hope for the innovation of new art. So I thought this was a perfect day to actually start this journey. And coincidentally, Peter Pan was published on October 10th, 1911. And now what's important about Peter Pan was Peter Pan started off as a play. It was initially a play for the upper and middle class. By publishing Peter Pan in printed form, now the lower class has access to this very important book. And so this is where we kind of start the journey with Peter Pan representing the Fool, written by Barry, published in 1910, based off a play. The next card we're going to move to is the Magician card. I'm going to talk about now the rise of dime novels and pulps. Stories are becoming cheaper. Now children could enjoy the stories as much as adults because they only cost a dime for a lot of these stories. So 1 year after the start of our journey, we have 1912. 1912 is very important because you have a lot of character archetypes being developed. One of the most famous writers of this time was Edgar Rice Burroughs. He's, of course, famous for two important characters, Tarzan and John Carter of Mars. Both Tarzan and John Carter of Mars will become the inspiration for future superheroes like Zorro, the Phantom, and eventually Superman. So this is a very important person for developing this whole entire underground pop culture type characteristics. Now, we're going to continue moving to 1911. This is the year that World War I kind of was on the decline and ending. But what happened after World War I was, this is the first time we saw mass destruction, new technologies being developed. This was right after the Industrial Age, when people were realizing, well, machinery is more important than spiritualism. After seeing the destruction of World War I, people realized, well, we should get back in touch with God and the spiritual realm. One person who was very influential in this was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, of course, known for Sherlock. It's kind of ironic that the cold, calculating detective, the author of this detective, is actually a person who believes in spiritualism. He actually publishes a spiritual magazine that talked about things like the Cottingham Fairies, which he thought were actually real. And he would actually he actually wrote the Sherlock Holmes book to criticize this. But you see, at this time, there is a division. Now there's people who are focusing on scientific progress and people who want to go back into the spiritual, magical realm. A lot of secret societies were being developed around this time. One of the most famous is the Order of the Golden Dawn, which Aleister Crowley, who was the Alan Moore character we were just talking about earlier, the person who inspired Alan Moore's stories, was a member of. And here's the symbol of the Order of the Golden Dawn. Ironically, the Golden Dawn is also named the Sparkling Twilight, and just look at the symbol. Interesting coincidence right there. The symbol was actually taken from Dr. John Faust, so another interesting connection there. 1911, we have two important works made. On the magical side, I actually got that wrong. It's supposed to be Aleister Crowley, but on that side, we have Aleister Crowley actually talking about all his practices and magical teachings and developing a fictional book about it, about a moon child, basically the Antichrist who would end up destroying the world. Alan Moore kind of carried this on by making Harry Potter the Antichrist in his League of Extraordinary Gentlemen book. But it's actually an interesting book if you want to go read it. On the science side, you have general relativity developed by Albert Einstein. But you kind of notice that a lot of these big scientists are actually very religious. You would think of them to be more atheistic in today's terms, but a lot of them are very religious. In fact, a lot of scientific progress were developed by spiritual people. Charles Darwin was actually originally supposed to be a clergyman. You have the Big Bang Theory being developed by a Catholic priest, and of course Albert Einstein clearly said God does not play dice. So even though people still look at the physical side and the spiritual side as one and the same, telling the same story, around this time you really start seeing a sharp division between this, and this will affect future works. Now we come to the third card, the Empress. The Empress card in traditional tarot represents rebirth, fertility, new life. So it's pretty appropriate that 10 years after the start of our journey in 1921, we have the birth of modernism, basically the first modern novels. Big players in this realm are, of course, T.S. Eliot, Virginia Woolf, and of course, James Joyce. They would later inspire what's known as the jazz and lost generation of writers, including Scott Fitzgerald, Hemingway, and Steinbeck. But the person we have here is James Joyce, influential for Ulysses, which is considered the greatest modern novel of all time. A lot of people consider it the first modern novel because of the techniques he used in writing the story. The idea of now inner monologue, chapters, character dialogue were first developed with him. So with the Empress card, you see the birth of basically the modern novel and modern storytelling. The next card we come to is the Emperor card. Emperor card represents foundation. The Emperor card is number 4. 4 you normally associate with foundation as in the 4 corners of the house, the 4 directions, the 4 classical elements in classical magic, and of course the 4 base pairs in DNA. So 4 represents foundation. So after the birth of modern novels, you start seeing the development and experimentation of these new technologies. We now started to have film, television, broadcast signals, radios. So people are taking these new ideas and actually developing. And during these years, the first initial tests that they did with these technologies and new mediums would basically become the template for all the future mediums to come. Some really important works was the Russian film Battleship, which was the first movie to actually splice up scenes to add tension. Another important thing were the first TV stations being developed around this time. But the one I wanted to talk about is the Threepenny Opera. Again, another person who Alan Moore was inspired by. The Threepenny Opera was very interesting. It goes along with the distancing effect, which is actually drawn from Chinese opera. The distancing effect, you guys will mostly know because you guys are MLP fans, is basically breaking down the fourth wall, especially with Pinkie Pie in this case. The importance of breaking down the fourth wall in his philosophy was by breaking down the wall, the barrier between the actors on the stage and the audience members, you start to realize that if the characters on the stage in this fictional story can change the outcome of their life, then the audience has just as much control over the course of their own life. So his idea is to talk about the importance of storytelling. And he's one of the people who you'll see throughout this whole entire lecture talking about the importance of art. He treats art as science. He thinks science is very important for our physical world, material progress, all that such. But for the mental side, the thing that gives us motivation, inspires us, makes us do political changes, all come from art. So artists should treat their own product as if it's a science. So I'm going to kind of rush through the first few slides because we want to get to the ponies, but we have a lot to cover before we actually get to the point, and I'm going to start with the Hierophant. Hierophant in traditional tarot represents education and seeking new knowledge. And this was around the time when the corners of the map were slowly being drawn in. We've just about completed the whole entire world. Age of exploration was very important. You started seeing people going to both the North Pole and South Pole exploring. This is basically the last unconquered land. So basically, we're going to know all the stuff about the world that we are supposed to know. So this is around the time when people are realizing, okay, I think we know everything we need to know. Einstein discovered relativity. We went to the South Pole. But this man would say no. He would say that knowledge is very, very troublesome because if you know, it's better to remain ignorant and in bliss. That our fear is the fear of the unknown. That's the thing that drives us. And of course, H.P. Lovecraft is a person who inspired a lot of future writers with his cosmic horror and gothic horror type stories. But actually, H.P. Lovecraft comes from a long line of previous artists and writers in what's called the Great Literary Game. When Alan Moore was questioned, well, you don't like people writing stories about your Watchmen characters. Why are you allowed to write League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, which takes from different characters? Alan Moore claimed that he was taking from what's called the Great Literary Game, in which writers will look at the previous writers who came before them and try to expand the stories. So basically what he's saying is all professional writers engage in fan fiction. And if you kind of look back at the shamanic traditions, the idea of telling stories through oral, word of mouth, passing it down from generation to generation, that's basically fan fiction because you're retelling the exact same story but in your own way. This, one of the more famous examples of literary game was started by Edgar Allan Poe in his only novel called Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. He had his character go all the way to the South Pole, and Poe stopped the book there, wasn't able to finish the second book. Jules Verne loved this story so much, he wanted to know what would happen to the person if he had to continue to the Antarctic. So in Jules Verne's Antarctic Mystery, he had the exact same character venture further into the Antarctic until he was stopped at a place called the Iron Mountains, and the compasses would spin like crazy, and his character stopped. H.P. Lovecraft loved this story so much, he turned the Iron Mountains into the Mountains of Madness. And of course, Alan Moore continued with his own story. And like I was saying, this comes from a long line of tradition. So when people criticize fiction writers for just copying previous works, this is a thing that's been done by almost every single culture from every single generation, and it's important for the development of new art. So, of course, Cthulhu Mythos is a very, very good example of someone working within a pre-existing world and developing a new world from this. So, next we have the Lovers card. Lovers represents the reunion of two forces. And this is very important because this is the start of the golden age of comics, specifically Superman. Comics are very, very interesting because unlike novels or television, they actually unite two distinct forms together. Back in the day, our very first language and art were one and the same. This picture of an ox on a cave is both the word for ox and a drawing of an ox. As time developed, pictures became more literal and words became more abstract like we have here. Of course, you have some things like Chinese language, for example, which still borrows from the original pictogram. But it was only around this time that you started seeing a division between art, the visual art, and language. Of course, people try to reunite these things again and again. You have, for example, illustrated text or illustrated scrolls or Imaki scrolls, which try to combine both pictures and words, but it wasn't really, really successful until The Yellow Kid was published. This was considered the first comic strip in which the character interacts with another character within the same strip and have meaningful dialogue. That's not just one-off political commentary. So this is the year where we have our the first comic that kind of started the whole entire superhero trend and launched the golden age of comics, Action Comics #1. This was also the time of the Great Depression, and as we move forward, you have the Chariot card. Chariot means expanding, looking forward, seeking for expansion. And you can see the effects of the Great Depression on a lot of authors around this time. You have William Faulkner and Ernest Hemingway writing books that actually dealt with the human condition. John Steinbeck was one of the most influential authors around this time. More importantly, his book received a lot of future criticism because around this time, people started banning and burning his books. And this is around the time you started seeing art being critiqued by people who are not artists themselves. So we go on to the next card, the Strength, and this is actually the 30th year of our journey. We come to 1941. Exactly, 30 years since the start of our journey. What's interesting is the fathers of the people who pioneered modernism and the modern novel, Virginia Woolf and James Joyce, died around this time. So you kind of see the death of modernism and the birth of postmodernism. Specifically, now the idea of storytelling is being taken away from novels and now being explored in the film medium. You have around this time the first feature-length animated film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs by Walt Disney, experimentation with Technicolor, including The Wizard of Oz, and Casablanca. But of course, the most important film around this time, considered the greatest film of all time, in fact becomes synonymous with greatness. You call something Citizen Kane of something if it's the best. Citizen Kane by Orson Welles. He looked at the idea of art needing limitations. He was restricted by studios, by corporations to dictate the course of his own movie-making process, but he actually saw that as a challenge. Without limitations, art is nothing. The greatest enemy of art is the lack of limitations. So even though he fought the studio process all his life and only made one film which he was really proud of, he liked it because it allowed for the rebirth of new types of explorations in storytelling. So we come around this time to the postmodern era. We come 40 years past the start of our journey. And this is post-World War II, where we saw the horrors of the Holocaust, bombing of Japan, Pearl Harbor, a lot of horrific tragedies. So around this time, people try to make sense of this. You have America retreating into a sense of isolationism and trying to build up the sense of Grand Americana, traditional families, traditional values. You see this a lot in I Love Lucy and television shows like that. Yet at the same time, you also see people trying to explore the human condition and critique it. Like, for example, J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye. While cults were forming around this time, science fiction author L. Ron Hubbard published Dianetics, another story that is kind of considered a new political movement, was Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand, which kind of explored this whole entire new potential of the human condition. Ayn Rand's philosophy it's interesting because Ayn Rand believes in the black and white philosophy. Her philosophy actually inspired Spider-Man's co-creator, Steve Ditko, who would go on to create a lot of great comics. Because Ayn Rand believed in the real world, there is black and there is white. There is things that are certain and things that are uncertain. And it's only the things that are certain that are true. A equals A. We know A equals A. We know 1 equals 1. However, in the realm of fiction and storytelling, A does not have to equal A. So why not do things that can't be done in the real world in fiction? That's one of her philosophies on art. She liked Charlie Angels because she knows Charlie Angels could not exist in real life. So that's why she enjoys it, because it's something that's impossible, that couldn't be replicated in the real world. So now we're coming to the 50th year of our journey, and we have the Wheel card. This is a very, very important time because now we're seeing the boom in science fiction, specifically the golden age of science fiction. The silver age of comics started around this time with Jack Kirby, Stan Lee, and Steve Ditko, like I just said. And it's very interesting that around this time you start seeing a lot of new television shows being developed, all centered around the science fiction theme. Specifically, Doctor Who and Star Trek are two notable examples that are still continuing on to this day. These are the pioneers of this time period. However, now that I do this talk, I like to actually use these authors as creators. Because up to this time, you had speculative fiction, which is made up of fantasy and science fiction. And fantasy and science fiction were kind of considered one and the same. A lot of people still try to group science fiction and fantasy together in the same boat. But you really start seeing the vision around this time. This is the time period where Tolkien wrote Lord of the Rings, and Michael Moorcock experimented with new wave science fiction. Now, what caused the division was Tolkien was really upset with the rise of Nazism, seeing how fascist a lot of these worlds are coming, and seeing industrialization. Tolkien liked growing up in small suburbs, simple villages, a simpler way of life. He didn't like the idea of new technologies, new materialistic innovations kind of dominating. Good morals should be the most important thing for J.R.R. Tolkien, so that's why he wrote about it in his Lord of the Rings book. Michael Moorcock does not like Lord of the Rings. Even though Michael Moorcock is considered one of the great science fiction writers in the past 50 years, he actually wrote a big critique of Lord of the Rings in his essay called Epic Pooh. He compared Lord of the Rings and Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe to Winnie the Pooh, in the sense that Winnie the Pooh is a safe, comforting story for children, that children could read. Some scary stuff might happen, but at the end of the day, Winnie the Pooh goes back to his home and is happy. That's what he saw Lord of the Rings as being. The hobbits go on a big, scary adventure, but at the end of the day, they go back to their home and they're nice and happy and they learn something from it. Michael Moorcock did not like that. In his new wave science fiction, he actually wanted to push the boundaries. He wanted to make stories that made people upset. He wanted to make stories that were really grotesque, that made us question our life and reality. He is in the same mindset as Alan Moore and Brett, in the sense that stories should be treated as a science. Art and stories should be treated as something that are important. Stories are here to force us to think about our conditions and improve from it. Stories should be a transformative force. Make us do something that we haven't done before. So his stories are always really grim, gloomy, they have a downer ending, but the point of them are trying to motivate us to become something more so we don't end up like people in his stories are. So now we're coming to the counterculture with the Lust card, also called the Justice card, also called the Lust card in the Doff deck. This is this time of the Beat generation where you have people like Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac writing On the Road, which would lay the ground for the future counterculture and the hippie movement of the 60s. This is around the time you have underground comics being developed and the anti-war movement on the rise with all the conflicts escalating in Vietnam. But what is important about this time is the idea of underground comics. Because up to this point, the big comic companies, DC and Marvel, were controlling how comics were published. That's why we see superheroes as the dominant genre in the comic industry today. Even though comics could tell any other type of story, detective stories, science fiction stories, mystery stories, they are all dominantly superhero stories because of DC and Marvel controlling it. What happened during the 60s was people started developing their own fanzines, own independent self-published comics. One person, Stanley O'Neill, wanted to take the most iconic American icon that he could find, and that was Mickey Mouse, and basically wrote a story involving Mickey and his friends doing stuff that we would call not safe for work in today's term. Mickey and Minnie were doing promiscuous stuff, they were running drugs, doing dope, a lot of stuff. He was hoping that Disney would get upset and try to sue him, but Disney didn't notice it at all. So he actually had one of his friends sneak this comic into a Disney board meeting, and of course right after that Disney got really, really upset. And this is around the time you start seeing different companies slowly taking more and more control of their copyrighted characters. Because up to this time you had things like Tijuana Bibles, fanzines, in which people were using copyrighted characters, but they were allowed to do so. It was only because of Disney appealing to Congress with the Mickey Mouse Copyright Protection Act, as it's called today, that now companies are cracking down on fan-created content, specifically because of what Danny O'Neill did with the Air Pirates. And as I was saying when we were looking back at H.P. Lovecraft, this is dangerous, because most of the greatest stories of all time, most of the progress we have made with storytelling has come from authors looking at previous authors who came before them and building off on stories and worlds that they have created. So now that companies are cracking down on different types of storytelling, it is now very, very hard to come up with new creative ideas that are meant to critique the old. Instead, the old is now just being photocopied over and over again because it's successful. And on the same note, we're going to look to Hollywood. This is the new Hollywood era. This is when blockbusters started becoming big. You had people like Steven Spielberg making Jaws, Martin Scorsese making Taxi Driver. Movies up to that point were still a developing medium. They weren't making as much money, so the studios started stepping away and letting independent artists create their own movies now. But it was when Steven Spielberg created Jaws that they realized, wow, this movie is actually making a lot of money. This is where we get the term blockbuster. It's the first summer blockbuster. And movie studios realized, hey, if we could crank out one of these blockbusters every single year, we could make a lot of money. And this becomes a very, very dangerous trade-off. This is a time when George Lucas made New Hope. George Lucas was very, very good because he did look at the old shamanic traditions of retelling stories using a template, specifically looking at Joseph Campbell's Harold's Journey. However, Lucas, to get his films made, would actually bow to a lot of the studios, and this is where we get the trade-off. Why this card is the Hangman. The Hangman card represents sacrifice. And like what we were saying with copyrighted characters not being allowed to be reproduced, studios, the only way they could start making money now is basically just preserving these copyrighted characters and rehashing them over and over again. So now you're starting to see a decline as animated TV shows are just using copyrighted characters just because they could sell a buck and just making cheaply produced cartoons. Instead of having the old films like Walt Disney films and Warner Brothers films, Chuck Jones and Tex Avery, where innovation was pushed with the cartooning medium, you just see dull, repeated images of He-Man over and over and over again because they were getting lazy, they wanted to save money. You see the same type of films and stories being told over and over again. So this is really around the time when you had a dark age, and not just the film industry, but you also saw a dark age in the animation industry and the comics industry. Now this is coming to the main part of our topic. We have right here the 1986 is a very, very important year. This is the 75th year since the start of our journey. We see the end of the comics Bronze Age and the Dark Age of comics and the Dark Age of animation. Like I was saying, video game characters are now just being mass-produced in the Saturday morning cartoons. That's why you look at the old Saturday morning cartoons. They're very flat. They aren't as animated as they are in the past or as they are now. But what's very important with this year is 3 very, very, very important comic books were published around this time that would change the face of the comics industry. You have Art Spiegelman's Mouse, Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns, and Alan Moore's Watchmen. Alan Moore was looking at the trend of what comics, films, and all these different entertainment mediums were taking. And Alan Moore, being a person who's a good friend of Michael Moorcock, being a follower in tradition of art being magic, his idea is art is magic. Art is a transformative force. When you actually think of magic, what happens is magic, a magician will create a spell that will have a transformative effect upon the person he's casting the spell on. And in the literal sense, you could think of an author as a magician. In creating a spell, he is spelling words in his book, or a person is drawing a picture. And when he gives this image to the audience will look at it and be changed. So when Alan Moore talks as art as magic, he means it in the literal sense that it has a transformative effect on a person. And this is why he's very, very upset with the state of the comic book industry. He sees comics as a form that could actually change the human condition. That's why he wrote books like Watchmen and V for Vendetta. And of course, you see V for Vendetta having an influence on the anonymous protesters. And he thinks this is the type of things that comics should be doing. They should be trying to have us question our current society and try to change them. Also, he was very, very upset with the superhero genre dominating the comic book industry. If you look at any other medium, television, novels, film, no one genre dominates any of these forms. However, comics are really the only medium that has one genre, the superhero genre, dominating 99% of what's being produced. And he didn't like that, so he was hoping to finally end the superhero genre by deconstructing it to the core. His hope was by ending the superhero genre, by making Watchmen, he would end the superhero genre, and people will finally get tired of superheroes and try to expand, making new comics. He actually created Watchmen in the way in which it can't be filmed. He wanted to make a comic that could do things film cannot do and that novels cannot do. So he was hoping that by, first of all, deconstructing superheroes, and second of all, making a comic that could do things that film and novels could not do, that it will inspire a new generation of comic creators to create new superhero works. Of course, as we know, his Watchmen story had the exact opposite effect. Instead of people stepping away from superheroes and trying new things, people start replicating Rorschach, the anti-hero personality, and then you saw the basically dark age of comics with the 90s boom and bust in comics, where people are just replicating what Rorschach was, the whole entire anti-hero, superheroes being grim, depressed, cussing all the time. Not what Alan Moore wanted. All the way in Japan, you see something very similar happen. Japanese animation was stepping away from its original roots. You had films like Akira trying to replicate the American Western comic type of storytelling. You have the works of Miyazaki looking at the old Walt Disney works. Around this time, a person who was very, very similar to Alan Moore was looking at the state of the animation industry, and around this time, the anime industry was controlled by the giant robot genre. And just like Alan Moore, he was saying, giant robots are holding animation back. Look at what Miyazaki and Akira are doing with their works. We should try to create anime that is not stuck to one genre and actually tries to expand the medium and create new things. But as you guys know, Evangelion, which was basically supposed to be the Watchmen for the giant robot genre in Japanese anime, again had the exact opposite effect of what it was intended. Instead of ending the giant robot genre, it gave way to new copycats of giant robots over and over and over again. So both Alan Moore and this fella had their ideas kind of crushed. But it's a really interesting reciprocal thing. The deconstruction that was started in the comics industry, in Western comics, moved to Japan and tried to influence the deconstruction of Japanese anime. Around this time, the American animation industry was kind of going downhill. Disney has lost its touch. It was losing out to other studio films like American Tail and Land Before Time. So around this time, Disney was actually going to close up shop, officially end the animation movies and animated studios. So they wanted to go out with a bang. So they decided, hey, let's take all our famous Disney characters and just go out with a big hurrah, just say farewell to them. And they talked to Warner Bros. Hey, can we borrow Bugs Bunny and some of your characters as well? So that's where we get the film Roger Rabbit. It was supposed to be a farewell to the days of animation and just close up shop and move on. However, again, the opposite thing happened. They made so much money with Who Framed Roger Rabbit that Disney actually had enough money to produce another film. And one of the films Walt Disney really, really wanted to produce before he passed away was Hans Christian Andersen's Little Mermaid. And so they finally decided, hey, let's produce the Little Mermaid film that they liked. And what came next is the animation renaissance. After every Dark Age, you have a renaissance. You look at the traditional Dark Age in human history. What came after the European Dark Ages? You had the Italian Renaissance. You need Dark Ages to have Renaissance. And now we are at the 80th year of our journey, exactly 80 years, 1991, from the start of our journey. And we see we see what's called the Disney animation Renaissance take place with The Little Mermaid, which was released around this time. But more specifically, now you start to see the television cartoon industry start taking shape. Because, like I was saying, around the 80s was the dark ages for animation. They were trying to cut corners, save money by repeating the exact same panels and sketches over and over again, keep the poses the same, just change the mouths. But now you're starting to see a whole new diversity of different types of characters, different shapes, different abilities. So it was not just a Disney Renaissance that happened around this time, it was also the animation Renaissance. So animated works were in basically their golden age now. The most important person this time is John Kay, who of course made a very, very, very popular show, Ren and Stimpy. John Kay is a bit like Alan Moore, how Alan Moore is to the comics industry. John Kay is like this to the animation industry. John Kay thought cartoons should be more cartoony, animation should be more animated. So why is it that we see the Saturday morning cartoons from the 90s just basically repeat the exact same poses over and over again? He didn't like this. He wanted to look back at the golden age of animation. Just like how the Italian Renaissance was born, it was born because people are looking back at the Greek and Roman gold ages. So John Kay was looking back at the golden age of animation during the 40s and 50s with people like Chuck Jones and Tex Avery. And what he saw was each of the characters had unique poses. So he incorporated that into his stories. For John Kay, if you work in his animation studio, you're never allowed to draw the exact same frame twice. You're never allowed to draw the exact same expression or character twice. Every single frame should be different. That's why his animation is so costly and expensive. But it gave, again, birth to all these different types of stories, because now people were saying, okay, we could actually experiment. We don't have to repeat the exact same things over and over again. We could try new things. This is where you see people like Lauren Faust get their start, working in the three big studios, Toon Disney, Cartoon Network, and Nickelodeon. Of course, with the Renaissance came the Industrial Age. And we are starting to see the Industrial Age take place in the 90s around this time. Industrial ages are not bad. The fact that I have the devil here does not mean this is a bad period. What the devil means in tarot is materialism. Simple as that. The devil doesn't mean evil, it just means material. And around this time, we started seeing the development of new things. CGI was just being experimented with. And we saw some fantastic new movies being developed. Terminator 2, Jurassic Park, all made use of this new CG film to innovate, CG technology to innovate their films. And it was very, very successful. It blended in with the mechanics that they were using really well. You saw a fully animated movie using this type of technology with things like Toy Story. You saw things like Titanic, one of the biggest grossing films of that era, actually making use of a new technology developed around this time. as the animation renaissance was kicking up, you started to see people have cartoons with strong female characters. So people realized, hey, we could put that in traditional live action television. You have Joss Whedon making strong characters, like with Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And you started seeing the rise of what's called a franchise, where people, like franchises have existed for a while now, but the modern idea of a franchise started really with Star Wars and picked up in the 90s, when you would have a movie and a tie-in show and a tie-in comic and all this stuff. Particularly, it's Lord of the Rings was very important because it was one of the first successful adaptation of a book into a movie. And now studios are realizing, hey, we could actually now start adapting these books into movies ourselves. So now we have another outlet for information. It's very interesting that Alan Moore made Harry Potter the Antichrist in the story, and that this is around the same time J.K. Rowling falls on the timeline. Not saying J.K. Rowling is the devil, but the idea that Alan Moore was trying to fight against, he didn't like the idea that J.K. Rowling made her story and basically sold out to the big studios just for money. Of course, if you know the other side of the story, it's because she was poor around this time, and none of this is really her fault. But if you think about Harry Potter was really the first big successful movie franchise that had a series that made so much money that studios began looking around for famous children book series that they could also be adapted. They tried to adapt the Dark Materials, Golden Compass story, Chronicles of Narnia, lately Twilight and Hunger Games. But on the plus side, she got people interested in storytelling again and reading, and so this is very important that now novels are coming back to the forefront. However, now we are coming to the 90th year of our journey. 90 years after 1911, we now have 2001, and we land exactly on the Tower card. It's kind of odd when I was making this timeline to find out the Tower card fell exactly on when 9/11 happened. But I guess it's also somewhat appropriate because if you think about the Tower, it's called the lightning struck tower in traditional tarot. Tower and lightning are normally associated with television shows because you have the broadcast tower sending out broadcast signals in the form of lightning. But at the same time, you also had some grim things like 9/11. And all these things kind of coalesce together because you started seeing a blurring of reality. TV shows were now being intercut with news breaks from the front lines of Iraq, from images of rubble from the World Trade Center. So now you see a blurring of reality and fiction coming together. And around this time, most television shows were more fantasy, Doctor Who, Starship Trooper, Battlestar Galactica, Star Trek type shows, where they were more dealing in the realms of escapism and fantasy. When this stuff started happening, people started realizing, well, we should try to look at the human condition and kind of retell it. And out of all the mediums, the best medium to talk about the human condition is television medium, because film is too short to basically build an emotional connection with a character. Comics are also not the appropriate medium, same as novels. They're too long and wordy, it's hard to connect with the characters. But television shows, because you grow with these characters over time, you check in with them each week, kind of like checking in with family members. Eventually, over time, you build an emotional connection to these characters, and they resonate. When something happens to these characters that are tragic, it resonates with the audience members. So that's why you started seeing new shows like Law & Order, West Wing, and Sopranos trying to replicate this. And of course, the most important one around this time was The Wire. I'm going to try to hurry up as my handle's almost over and get to the ponies, but after you have a grim age like the Tower card, you have the Star. Star represents hope, a ray of hope. Around this time, all we've been talking about were comics, printed novels, television, and film. So far in the last century, we have not seen a new form of technology being developed. Around this time, you saw the rise of what's called a visual novel in Japan, a computer interface type story that was developed from the video game industry, now allowing new types of story to be told, because there's only a certain type of story that could be told with a film or a comic book. But now with a new medium, you could tell a lot of new types of stories that couldn't be told in these pre-existing forms. Clannad is one of the big ones of this period. And now we come to the Moon card. Moon represents confusion in traditional tarot. It represents depression. Also represents laziness, decline. And this is probably where Alan Moore is getting to when he's saying that things like Harry Potter are the Antichrist. He's saying that it's the Moon Child, and I guess in his term, it's the Antichrist is called the Moon Child, in fact, in the sense that they're getting lazier, just rehashing old material over and over again, not trying new experimental things. And you really see this around this time. You have thriller novels on the boom because of works like Da Vinci Code. You have Hasbro taking one of their old franchises from the animation Dark Ages and trying to reboot it with big flashy CGI and not trying anything new or innovative, but just trying to cash in on something. You have horrible, bland animation, things that John Kay hates, being done by Seth MacFarlane. Family Guy, American Dad, Cleveland Show, just all derivatives of each other. Very flat, not animated, not trying anything new. And even things like Avatar, which people are trying to say is one of the most important films in recent decades, it's just glorified CGI with a bland storyline. And in 10 years, almost every film will be doing what Avatar is doing, so there's nothing really important about this. And Stephanie Meyer, we're not going to talk about her. So, but after the Moon, what comes? We have the Sun, and now we're on 2008. And you start seeing the Clannad work being adapted into an anime. You have Dark Knight Rises taking a traditionally bland, staunch character and actually trying to do something new with him, make him more realistic, grim and gritty, and actually tell a new type of story with Batman. You have TV shows like Breaking Bad, breaking the boundary, Scott Pilgrim. A lot of new works are being innovative around this time because with hope you need change. That's what Barack Obama was talking about, so it's appropriate that this was happening around this time Barack Obama was running for president. Breaking Bad, I don't need to say much about this. It's an amazing TV show, go watch it. So now we come to the next card, the Judgment card. So where does this all lead up? We have come to almost 100 years of history, and we are still looking, is Alan Moore right? Has culture really been in decline? Well, now we are in an age where technology and information is at our fingertips. We could create new types of comic books. You see the boom in web comics. You see things like Homestuck trying new things. You see things like TV tropes actually deconstructing all these old works and looking at all the little tropes that make them nice. Cabin in the Woods is something that actually is very important, the deconstruction thing. You see, but unlike Alan Moore and Evangelion, instead of just deconstructing something and leaving it all grim, people after deconstructing would try to reconstruct it, look about what was good about the Golden Age and try to recreate of what was good. So this is basically, you have reconstruction and deconstruction around this time. Of course, you have the magical girl genre being deconstruction, but then reconstructed again. And I put Stephen Moffat here because this is also the time where we fans could be the critic. If we don't like Stephen Moffat, we just make an angry blog post or rant about it on Twitter. Now the walls between the creator and the fan are slowly dissolving because now all major creators and actors have social media. Now people are thinking we could all become critiques. So you see things like Nostalgia Critic and JonTron now revealing a lot of stuff. Umineko, very, very important work, a visual novel that actually deconstructs the mystery genre and reconstructs it again. So, this is an example. And now we come to exactly 100 years past the start of our journey. So, you had the Chinese Revolution, took place October 10th, 1911. It was the year that it was the exact same day Peter Pan was published. The flag of the Chinese Revolution was the sun flag. You have now October 10th, 2011. Look at this sun flag. What could it be? So now we come to the very last card in the tarot deck, the World, and now we come to the animation revival. Like I was saying with the boom in technology, where now the walls are being splintered, we have endured a lot. A lot of people question, why are college-age students bronies? What's the idea of the whole entire brony phenomenon? If they actually understood the history of animation, the history of what I just talked about, it will make perfect sense. A lot of people who grew up during the animation renaissance are now college-age students. Most of us grew up during the animation renaissance. And while most generations basically say, well, it was better during my time, we were kind of the first generation that also had YouTube and illegal downloading and stuff. So we could actually share these old works. If we wanted to say it was better, animation was better during the animation renaissance during our time than the Johnny Test days, we could actually pull up a video of Iron Giant or Powerpuff Girls and say, see, this is why it's better. So we are actually now conscious of what's being created and is influencing a lot of people. Flapjack was a very important work around this time because three big shows evolved from the writing team of Flapjack: Regular Show, Adventure Time, and Gravity Falls. And of course, this is where we come to My Little Pony: Friendship is Magic. 100 years after the start of the journey, My Little Pony aired on October 10th, 1910, and it was one of the first new revitalized animated shows that actually got a lot of media attention, particularly because of the bronies. And the confusion of why adult males, college age, will enjoy it. But if they understood that a lot of people came from the animation renaissance to this, you'll see the buildup of how pop cultures evolved during the days, how different types of mediums been used. Instead of doing what Michael Bay did and try to make use of big CGI and stuff, Lauren Faust had everything against her. She had a show that was basically the butt joke of culture for the last 20 years. Using flash animation, the worst form of animation, something that John Kane would hate. Had to put marketing and product placements in all her works. Had to make a show that appealed to little girls. Had to use a lot of pink. Have a giant hot air balloon almost every single episode. So everything was against her. And yet she produces something that was actually pretty good. And if Lauren Faust could take something that had everything going against her and make something that was new, now it's going back to the distancing effect, that now the fourth wall should be dropped, because now we have a real world example. You've seen fictional characters look at their condition and try to change their situation. Now we have a real life example, Lauren Faust actually looking at all the odds against her and actually making something really new. And now so we come back to the Fool. The start of our journey, we come back to the Fool. The cycle is ended. The Fool is the 0 card and the 22nd card. So now where do we stand after 100 years? Will we have new type of art forms? Video games are now on the rise, but are video games considered art? A lot of people now saying it can be because of the new types of storytelling. We have online sources like YouTube and Tumblr. People can now actually produce their own art and get it out to the public without having a studio control them. New types of shows like Netflix, House of Cards, instead of being stuck to the traditional 44 minutes or 22 broadcast episode time, House of Cards can now have an episode that's 18 minutes long or 55 minutes long. It's as long or short as needed to be. It's not restricted. You have things like rewrite. You have things like digital comics. So now you have a lot of new technology to try to create your own innovative show. And I guess with that, I come to the end of my presentation. Thank you for sticking around. And I do have to leave because of the next panel, but if any questions, I'm willing to answer any questions as I'm packing up. So, yeah, is there any questions? What? Yes.
Do you think that art is in decline?
No.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, because of Alan Moore. I actually, well, like I said, if Lauren Faust, like My Little Pony is not Citizen Kane. It's not the greatest thing of all time. But if Lauren Faust could take something that had everything against her and actually apply the idea of making use and changing your own situation and make something that's actually incredible, that's called a ray of hope, a sign of hope. Lauren Faust represents hope because she could take something bad, crap, and make it gold. So if she can do that, then I don't think art is in decline. It's what Alan Moore was saying. Artists should realize that their profession is a profession of transformative magic. So if artists take their product more seriously, instead of like Seth MacFarlane, but took their art seriously as if it's its magic trying to inspire the populace, then art will have a very successful future, especially with new things like digital comics and visual novels and all that. Yes?
So about the whole things about the tarot cards, were these assuming about the whole things about, you know how they were using like fortune telling and such? Are these like assuming they're all in the upright position or down?
Well, I'm assuming it's all in the upright position. I'm a medical student at Johns Hopkins University, so I don't really buy a lot of magical nonsense and superstitious stuff. But I do think tarot cards are very interesting in that they could actually track a course of history, which is where I did it here, and they all the time, like I didn't change any card out of order. Each of them appropriately fit. The Tower fit exactly around 9/11. The Death fit around the deconstruction of comics. The Temperance fits around the animation renaissance. So I just thought they make a perfect timeline. So, okay, thank you for coming in.